Hi everyone from Dunrovin Ranch in Lolo, Montana. Today is Thursday, the 27th of September. And I'm going to do a special edition of Tall Tales from Life's Trails, focused on the animals that have lived at Dunrovin and have since departed. I was unable to attend the blessing of the animals that Kelly so beautifully organized this last week, although I did go back and look at it, and I was very moved by everybody's blessing of their particular animals. And I was also very grateful to Kelly for having made this display of animals who have left Dunrovin. And if you notice carefully, if you'll focus on it for a moment, Jake, we've added a name. This was a difficult week for us because we sent Chief off to the vet. He had a difficulty breathing this last weekend. So we called the vet on Monday and we took him in. And at first the vet thought it was just an infection in what's called a guttural pouch that he's had for years. Chief has had a bloody nose for years and years, and it never really bothered him. But it was more than a guttural infection. It was a tumor. It wasn't a malignant tumor, but it was a big tumor, and it was going to just cut off his breathing. It was very similar to what happened to Smokey, and all these years I've never seen this before, and suddenly 2 horses within the space of 1 year are afflicted with this particular issue. So I decided to euthanize Chief. He was going to suffer a painful death if he was allowed to continue with the tumor growing, and there was no possible surgical answer to the dilemma. So unfortunately, we had to say goodbye to Chief this year. But I wanted to go through all of the equines that have called Dunrovin home since I started Dunrovin. And I've given Jake a stack of photos to kind of go through the animals. And I'm going to go through them in alphabetical order with the exception of one. And I couldn't find a photo for this particular animal. And it's because she was here before the time of digital cameras, before we had digital cameras. And her name was Sugar. Sugar was a pony that Con Ovnik bought very early on, right after we moved to Dunrovin, for the kids to use. She was a white pony, a beautiful little pony, but an older pony, and she lasted about 6 years with us. The kids did ride her on occasion. And then one late March, I found her frozen to the ground, and she wasn't dead, although she had that look in her eye that she was resigned. And I wasn't going to let her just freeze in the pasture, so I called a vet, and he helped me get her up, and we put her in our barn area and kept her there and kept her warm and kept her really well fed and very well tended through the rest of the spring and the end of winter. And that summer, I let her out on green grass. You never do that with a pony because ponies are what are called easy keepers. They will founder if they eat really rich, nutritious green grass. And founder is like diabetes. It ends up in your feet. And it can be fatal for horses. So you have to be very careful about how much rich grass they eat. But I knew that Sugar was not going to last through the following winter. So I made sure that she had a really wonderful summer. She ate to her heart's content. She clearly was getting on. Better during the summer, but getting on and frail. And then on one early November morning, just as the temperatures were starting to dip in Montana, I had my neighbor dig a big hole down by the river, and we took Sugar down there, and I had a vet euthanize her there, and we buried her near the river. So Sugar was the first equine to depart from Dunrovin. I'm going to ask Jake then to put up some photos, and I'll start, as I said, in alphabetical order. And not all of the animals that I'm going to be mentioning today are on this sign. And I'll tell you why as I get to them. Annie is, of course, first because her name is Annie and it starts with an A. But it's fitting that she be first because she was the first animal to come here, the first equine to move to Dunrovin. She was the matriarch of the herd. And I also want to say that Jake is keeping his eye on the member chat. If you have any questions on any of the animals that I'm talking about, please just chime in on the chat and Jake will relay the question to me via the telephone. So please ask questions as I go along. But I purchased Annie within a year of moving back to Montana. And she was a great going horse. I wanted a horse that would be an endurance horse, and she had all the right spirit. But unfortunately, she became involved in an accident, and we don't know exactly what the accident entailed because it happened during a horrendous hailstorm. She was in a pasture, not here at Dunrovin, but at another farm, with 3 or 4 other animals, and we don't know whether she was kicked or she fell or whatever happened, but it happened the afternoon of the thunderstorm and the hailstorm, and it damaged her knee to the point where she could not be ridden. I had her operated on twice. I continued to ride her between each of those operations, but each time the fix failed, and I realized within a year of having purchased her that she would never be ridden again. But that didn't deter me from loving her. And one of the things that happened when I bought Annie is she had a foal, a beautiful champagne foal. And I thought, well, if Annie can't be ridden, maybe I could breed her. And so I did commence to breed her. And the stud that had produced this beautiful foal with her when I bought her lived in California. His name was Sun's Golden Aryan or something like that. Anyway, I contacted the people who owned the foal because I wanted to know more about the foal, who by that time was a 3-year-old. And they told me what a wonderful, gentle, kind horse it was, and they recommended that particular crossing highly. So I contacted the stallion's owner in California and commenced to try to get Annie pregnant via artificial insemination, and believe me, it was an ordeal. I had to run out to the airport multiple times, pick up semen, bring it back, give it to my vet to do the deed, and then see if she was pregnant. If it didn't take, start all over. And indeed, it didn't take for several tries, but on the 3rd or 4th try, Annie took, and it was wonderful. And through the years, Annie has, just assumed the role of the matriarch until she got older, and then she passed that baton on to the foal that was born that year, which was, of course, is my lovely lady Lonza. Annie died earlier this year, and the truth is I still miss her. She was a defining feature of Dunrovin. She was here the whole time and knew it well, and we knew her well, and her absence is very much felt. If you look at the photos here, you'll see that she was commonly painted, and she was commonly used by kids to learn how to lead horses. She was used on groundwork. She couldn't be ridden, but she was very friendly and very kind to people. I miss her. Okay, the next horse is Charger. And I know many of you knew Charger. He was very distinguishable on the web cameras. Big horse, a big blue roan with a big white splash on his face. Just a really handsome horse and a wonderful, kind horse. I just think of him and children. If you notice the little boy in the upper right-hand corner of the photo collage that Jake is showing you, he was our gentle giant. We called him our gentle giant, and he really lived up to the name. He was just a delightful horse, and his only hesitations were around machines of any sort. He didn't like machines, and in fact, when he was out on the trail, and we might come up to a large piece of equipment that would be used in, say, forestry or something, he would get a little nervous. There goes Cola. Let me see if I can't get Cola back. Cola! Cola! Cola, come. guard. You know, somebody can't be walking down the road without him taking notice of the whole affair. Anyway, Charger would get a little nervous around machines, but his idea of nervous was not to run off or to panic or to do anything. It was to stop and give it the evil eye and be a little bit hesitant and walk around it a little bit. But he was a very solid citizen, a wonderful horse to give to a beginner and little children. Everybody loved Charger. And as many of you know and many of you saw, Charger fell in our winter pasture one winter and broke his neck. And it was a very sad day when Jamie called me and I went out to see if we could help get him up, but there was no getting him up. We called the vet to come right out to the field and put him down because he was in pain and suffering. And we wanted him to go quietly. We miss Charger. He's been a wonderful horse to us, just a great asset to Dunrovin. The next horse that I'll show you is, of course, Chief, that died just yesterday or the day before. And Chief was another wonderful children's horse. In fact, look at the picture down in the lower left-hand corner. I just love that picture. The little boy's in his pajama bottoms leading Chief, and Chief just was a consummate child's horse. Never, ever gave anybody any trouble for any reason whatsoever. Chief had been owned by a woman who had multiple sclerosis. So he was what you would call a steady Eddie, a complete steady Eddie. And only once did we have a problem with him, and we knew something had to be wrong because that was not his nature. He bucked one time, and this was when Jamie was still working for me, and we thought, no, that can't be right. That's just not Charger. Charger is not somebody who takes any kind of offense to his rider. So sure enough, we checked on his back, and he had an infection along his back that was very painful. So we worked with the vet and we corrected that, and Chief went right back to being his wonderful gentlemanly self. He was used extensively in the mountain trails. He was a very solid horse who never bobbled, never stumbled, just a wonderful, reliable horse. And the next photo is of Chief just a month ago. A month ago on August 18th, we held our equine art extravaganza, and Chief was one of the horses painted, and isn't he beautiful? I'm really happy that he was able to participate in that, and I will cherish the photos of him in that, playing that role this last year, as we will miss him for years to come for sure. The next horse in alphabetical order is Cool Dude, and Cool Dude passed during the past year too, in November of last year, I believe. And Cool Dude was one heck of a great pony. He was a pony of America, an opinionated little pony, particularly with the other members of the herd. I know many of you would hear him squeal at the other members of the herd, and he would strike out. He and Mickey frequently got into it between their two stalls if they were too close to each other. But he always treated people and children with great respect. He was wonderful, stable, totally predictable, and a lot of fun for people and for little children. He just was the consummate kid's pony. Lots of kids rode him, but also lots of special guests who were a little bit afraid of larger horses. We would put them on Cool Dude because he was a sturdy little guy, and a small adult could easily ride him. In fact, he was the one who took one of our most memorable guests, the Nagasaki survivor who came here from Japan, and she was 70 years old and never ridden a horse, and she wanted to ride a horse, so we put her on Cool Dude, and at first we walked her, and she said, faster, I want to go faster. And so I started running so that Cool Dude could trot, and she said to me, faster, I need to go faster. And pretty soon I was giving her the reins. She'd never ridden a horse before, and she had Cool Dude cantering around the arena. She was just delighted. She had been badly burnt in the atomic blast in Nagasaki, so she couldn't smile. In fact, she had no facial expressions at all. but her eyes just twinkled, and she came to me and she said she wanted to live and work here so she could ride Cool Dude. We miss him, and we'll miss him for years to come. The next horse is gone, but he's not dead at all. His name is Dandy. And Dandy, he didn't come with that name. This is an interesting story about my buying Dandy. I was in the market for horses, and I heard about a horse in Bozeman, and I had a business trip to Bozeman, so I called the guy who had the horse, and I went to see him. And I have to admit, the guy who owned him was something of a jerk. When I first got there, feet were in bad shape, not sick exactly, but poorly trimmed, he had poor foot care. And I said something about his weight, and the guy just, was very gruff to me. And then I asked him if I could ride him, and we rode out, and then I asked the man to, turn around, take his horse home so I could see how he behaved on his own. Well, he was wonderful. He just did a fabulous job. Just a really lovely horse with a gorgeous, wonderful gait. He could both do what's called an extended trot and the Tennessee walking running horse walk. So I told the man that I was interested in him, but I wanted to take him to a vet first. And so I called my own vet and said, could you recommend somebody in Bozeman that I could take this horse to? I didn't want to take him to the guy's vet. And it's interesting because when we got there, the vet that my vet put me into contact with said the same two things that I had said. His feet were in bad shape and he was underweight. And the guy who still owned the horse at this point started to lunge the horse. And you should know what lunging is a little bit by now by having watched us here at Dunrovin. Lunging is when you have the horse on the end of a long lead and you turn the horse around you. He started to do this in the parking lot along a pretty busy highway in Bozeman. And the horse, and I don't remember what the horse's name was at that point, got completely tangled up in the lunge line or the long line. And he just stopped. He just stopped. And the more I saw of this horse, the more I wanted him because it seemed to me he had exactly the right temperament. He was calm, even though the guy that was handling him was a total jerk. So I bought the horse and I brought him home, and I named him Dandy because I thought he was just a terrific horse who had come from some rather difficult circumstances. He had been fed on a round bale feeder at this ranch where the guy had kept him, and he was the low man on the totem pole, so he didn't get nearly enough to eat. And my father always used the word dandy. When something was fun and of high merit, he'd say it was dandy. It's a dandy day. It's a dandy person. So I thought, this is a good name for this horse. I called him Dandy. So Dandy came, and we used him, and we had a young woman work for us, Laura Bozak. And many of you, I remember, you know her because she was here until about, I think, 2016 or there's about. Anyway, she took a real liking to Dandy, and Dandy took a liking to her. And some horses just do better when they're one-on-one than they are in a string of horses. Some horses are just totally good with having many different riders. Chief was that way, Monty's that way, Rocket's that way. They can have lots of different riders and they just get along with everybody. Charger was that way. But Dandy really wasn't. Dandy didn't like having a lot of different riders. So I went to Laura and I said, you really like this horse and this horse really likes you. I think you should buy him. So she did. She bought Dandy and she moved him to a little place about 15 miles south of where we are. And every now and then I still see Dandy on her Facebook posts. She continues to ride him and he's doing very well. Really a talented horse. Lots of different gaits and lots of different athletic abilities. We miss Dandy, but we're really glad he found a home with Laura. The next horse I'm going to be showing you is Denali. And of course, Denali means the great one in Athabascan. And Athabascan are the Indian group, the Native American people in the interior of Alaska. And Denali has an interesting story as well. The woman I bought Annie from had a lot of Tennessee Walkers, and she bred Tennessee Walkers. In fact, Mickey was one of her Tennessee Walkers, and she came out of one of her studs. She had a stud there. And a guy who was from Sweden owned some Tennessee Walkers on a ranch about 150 miles east of here. And he got in trouble with the U.S. IRS, and he was being deported because of tax fraud and evasion. And so he left the country, and he left a small herd of Tennessee Walkers on this big ranch, and nobody was caring for them, so the word got out. And the people who care about horses and about Tennessee Walkers offered him money to move these horses and to take them. So my friend who had owned Annie, from whom I purchased Annie, was one of the people to go and pick up one of the horses. And she picked up this big, he was 17 hands high, big horse, a big head, jet black. And again, I don't remember what his name was, but my friend Con Ovnik, who, by the way, recently died, I think all of you know that, just last month he died. He was a wonderful friend and just a great asset to me and the ranch. He was always looking out for horses for me. He suggested that I buy this horse because it was such a good horse, and indeed, Denali was an incredibly wonderful horse, another gentle giant. Dandy did have a persistent health issue. He had asthma in much the same way that people do. It's called heaves in horses, and the reason it's called heaves is to expel the air. It takes extra strength on their diaphragm muscles, and so they develop what's called a heave line along their sides. You can see it when they're trying to exhale air. So they treat it just like they do asthma in people. I was given some medications and an aspirator. And I used this regularly. And one time I took him with my son, and you'll see that in the upper left-hand corner is my young son, Mark. He's only 8 in this photo. And in this photo, he's putting on what are called, hobbles on Denali's legs so he can be let off in the backcountry to graze for a little while but can't move off too fast. At any rate, Mark, who, at about 8 or 9, and I were going to go on a long 10-day pack trip, and he was going to ride Denali and I was going to ride my horse Power. But the road that we got in on, it was a long road into Idaho, and we were going to pack back into Montana, was so dusty that Denali became very sick. And I was out of telephone range, out of any kind of communication range, although I was with a group of people, including an outfitter who had quite a bit of medications for animals. And anyway, when we got there, I talked with my son, and I said, I don't think this horse can make the trip. We need to take him home, and we need to do it when there's not going to be any dust on the road, which means the middle of the night when there's nobody else on the road. And so I gave the horse some penicillin, and I loaded him up, and Mark was very disappointed, but very compassionate and understood entirely that our first priority was to the horses. So even though they had already packed all our gear on the mules and they were ready to take off the next day, they just went ahead and took all of our gear, and we turned around and went at night to bring Denali home and took him to the vet. And indeed, he was in the vet room, hospital for about 3 days and came back just fine. But it was at that point that I started being really careful about dust in my trailers, and I had my 2-horse trailer modified so that it would keep dust out just for Denali. And Denali lived for, I don't know, another 10 years after that. He lived to be about 20, and he suddenly died of colic. It was a very sad day when Denali died, and I miss that horse. He was another horse that you could just give to a beginner, and they'd take such good care of them. In fact, on the lower left hand, you'll see a woman standing by the river, and I so remember this day. This was a beginning rider, a good friend of mine, and I told her, I said, you know, it's time you took a horse off by yourself. And she looked at me and says, oh no, I'm not going off by myself. Oh, I said, you can take Denali off by yourself. And I said, I'm going to put my chair right here by the river, and you can go across the river and up to the top of the mountain, and I'll keep track of you with my binoculars. And she did it. She went all the way to the top of the mountain with Denali and came back, and she was so proud of herself and so happy with herself. Denali was that kind of horse. He'd go off by himself and not give anybody any trouble. Just a wonderful horse. The next horse is Flash. And I know many of you knew Flash as well. Flash is still alive. And the reason Flash has departed from us is that he came up lame one November day in the north pasture. Jamie came to work, and Flash could not even put his leg down. And we had no idea what was happening with Flash. I went out there and I picked his leg up. I put my hand all around it. I could feel no heat. Normally, if you've had a muscular issue or a tendon issue, you're going to have some kind of inflammation, which means heat. It didn't look like there were any broken bones. I looked at the hoof. The hoof looked fine. So I called the vet. And the vet came, and we ended up building a little stall around him because Flash couldn't move at all. We built a little stall in the corner of the north pasture right by the road. And the vet came morning after morning for about a week trying to figure out what was wrong with Flash. And ultimately he said he probably had a stretched nerve. This happened in late November when the ice was just starting to form and we had all the horses in the north pasture. Flash may have slid in a way that stretched a nerve in his leg. And the vet said it will take years for this to heal. Nerves just don't heal very well. And he suggested that we put him down, but I wasn't willing to do that. So Jamie and I, we got some pain medication and we got him into the barn area, and Flash stayed there for over a year and a half. And he gradually, very gradually, got better and better. But it was clear he would never be used as a string horse again, which was really too bad because he was a wonderful string horse. He just, again, a steady Eddie. I mean, nothing bothered Flash except one thing, and that was if you tried to put on a raincoat or anything that was crinkly like plastic on while you were on his back, he would get very nervous and sort of dash away. He didn't run far, and he didn't buck or try to lose his rider, but he would just sort of dash away. And I remember one time I took a woman, a lawyer from Seattle, into the Bob Marshall Wilderness on Flash, and I told her a couple times, I'm sure I told her a half a dozen times, do not put your raincoat on while you're on him. If it starts to rain, wait for me and I will come and hold him while you put your raincoat on. Well, of course, that's not what she did. She put it on, and Flash zipped aside, and it really scared her very badly. And oftentimes when people are afraid, they get angry. So she took her anger out on me, and it was one of my most unpleasant experiences of guiding, was her taking it out on me. And of course, there were a lot of people there, and she was just having a riot going after me. And I just stood there and said that she was right. No matter what she said, I said she was right, and I just wanted to de-escalate the situation and get going again. But she got back on, and she regained her confidence and ended up having a good trip. That happened on the first day of the trip. But Flash was a real steady Eddie for us. We used him a lot. In fact, the woman over on the lower left-hand side, that's with Flash in the red coat there, she was 67 when she went on this big trip with us. This is near the Bob Marshall Wilderness at a ranch called the Theodore Roosevelt Memorial Ranch. And that was her last big riding trip, and she just did a fabulous job. She loved Flash, and Flash just took excellent care of her. Her name was Pat. So Flash, we miss him, but he went to live with Dandy's mother, with Laura. Laura now has 2 daughters. And one of them, a 4-year-old, is riding Flash, and it's perfect. It's a perfect situation for Dandy, and it's a perfect situation for Flash. Our next photo is of Martine. Martine, many of you knew Martine. He came to us with navicular. That means he had feet issues. His feet hurt him. And he came with us when I bought Smokey. The person who owned Smokey also owned Martine, and Martine would have been left by himself. And they were very bonded. So I agreed to take Martine. I didn't buy him. I just took him as a rescue. And Martine was never ridden here, but he was used often as a horse to be painted. People used him on the ground. And interestingly, people who had ailments themselves were naturally drawn to Martine. He had a very sympathetic eye, a very easy way of going with people. And I know many of you watched him walk rather awkwardly around here. He looked like he was in pain, and oftentimes he was. And we ended up giving him a lot of pain medications to keep him more comfortable, which ended up giving him stomach issues and digestive issues. And so we had to put Martine down a couple of years ago. And he was a loss. Even though he was never used riding, he was a presence here, and people loved being around him. We often think of Martine, our horse of many hands, as we called him. And the next horse I'll talk about is Power. And anybody who's been with me for any time knows that this is just an enormously a special horse to me. I did endurance riding for a number of years, and Power was my main horse for, I don't know, 12 or 13 years. And we went everywhere. I mean, I've ridden Power thousands of miles in Montana's backcountry, and through some very hair-raising situations. He was an incredible horse, an incredible lead horse. He and I were bonded at the hip. Riding him was like he was part of my body. I would just think I want to go in a particular direction or at a particular speed or in a particular way, and he would just go that way and do those things. He was wonderful, big, strong, assertive. I had troubles with him when I first bought him because he was so assertive, and that's in fact how I met Brandon Carpenter. I was at a clinic in Three Forks, Montana with Power, and I got thrown out of the clinic because Power was such a bad actor, and I wasn't able to control him the way I wanted to. So somebody suggested that I talk to Brandon, and I did, and Brandon really helped me and really was a turning point because I better understood how to handle Power, and once I made that change and made that connection, he and I were just a pair. And Power died of colic while I was not here at Dunrovin. I was in California. And I'll never forget the vet calling me on my cell phone while I'm driving near Sacramento, California, telling me that Power was in dire shape. He kept him alive for another 24 hours to see if there was anything would improve, but he said no, this was a situation that was not going to get better. Power was just 20 years old at the time, and I had hoped that he would have a nice long retirement, but he didn't. And I really miss him. He was just, you get a once-in-a-lifetime horse that is that bonded to you, and that was Power for me. The next horse is Romeo, and Romeo he's fine. He's not living here anymore. Romeo came at the same time that Chief came. In fact, Romeo and Chief were very bonded, so bonded that I had to split them up by several pastures so that they wouldn't just have fits about not being next to each other. They came from different places, but they immediately bonded, and to the point where you couldn't take one without the other one getting upset. So we had to work through that at first. And Romeo was not that good of a string horse in the same way that Dandy wasn't. He wanted a rider. And we had a fellow working for us for a number of years, a guy named Cliff, who just loved Romeo, and Romeo bonded with him, and they just had a wonderful situation. But as Romeo got older, his ability to put up with multiple riders just got less and less. And so we decided this last year, he was getting older, that it would be nice if we could find Romeo a home with one rider who was only going to ride him occasionally because he was nearing retirement. Well, luckily, one of our wranglers from this year had an aunt who wanted an older horse, to ride a couple times a week on short trail rides. She came out, rode Romeo, and bought him. So Romeo has the perfect retirement. He's off with 3 other horses, and I'm sure he's doing fine. They've sent us some photos of him, and I'm really happy that he found exactly the right situation for him. Okay, the next animal is Senior Kona. I can't say enough about Senior Kona. Senior Kona was my first donkey, and I can't believe I bought a donkey, but if I had to buy the first donkey, boy, Senior Kona was the right one to buy. He was fabulous. I met his father at a ranch south of Bozeman. I had taken my horse there, and every day I rode, and Senior Kona's father, a donkey named Ankh, would come and hang out with me while I saddled up Power, and then I'd ride off, and I'd come back, and he'd come and visit with me again, and I fell in love with him. So when I came home and I explained to Sterling that I'd fallen in love with a donkey and I thought we needed one, you know, he said, well, what do you need a donkey for? And I said, well, comic relief, what else? And he didn't say no, so that meant yes in my book. So I called the people who owned Ankh, and they said, well, Ankh has a foal, and he's in Twin Bridges. Well, I had a foal too. Her name was Lady Lanza. So Senior Kona and Lady Lanza were born the same year, about 3 months apart. Lady Lanza was a few months older than Senior Kona. So as soon as Senior Kona could be weaned, I went and got him and brought him home, and he immediately bonded with Lady Lanza, and it was the funniest pair you ever saw. Lady Lanza would go galloping in the pastures, and Kona would try to keep up with her. He'd have his little nose in the air, and he'd look at you as if to say, I don't know why we're running, but we're running, and he just loved being with her. And the first couple years, I took Kona everywhere. I took him to the grocery store, I took him to school. My kids were mortified that I would show up at school with a donkey. My husband built a ramp to put him in the back of my car so I could take him to the trailheads to go hiking with him. He did everything. He appeared in, you can see in the photos there, he's at a church. That was for Palm Sundays. He would participate in the Palm Sunday parades. He's in a parade in the lower left-hand corner there. He pulled a cart in a parade at the homecoming parade. He won first prize one year, not that particular year, but a different year. And of course, we dressed him up and just took him everywhere. And he died very suddenly. Donkeys don't show illnesses very well. They're very stoic. And one winter day, he became ill, and by the end of the day, he was dead. And the interesting thing about that, it was during the winter, and we couldn't dispose of his body right away, so we covered it with a tarp. And my ranch manager's dog had become very attached to Senior Kona. They were friends, and that's an interesting combination because donkeys are used as guard animals in much of Europe because they will chase canines and kick them or bite them. But Urso, a big, kind of a furry dog, attached himself to Kona, and when Kona died, he wouldn't leave his body. He just stayed there until we were able to dispose of his body. Just a few days, it took us a few days to figure out what to do. But it was the saddest thing to see Urso sitting there long periods of time with Senior Kona. The next series of photos is of a horse that's not on here, and she's very much alive. Her name is Serena. This was Lady Lanza's first foal, Serena. Actually, it's her second or third foal, second foal, I think, second foal, Serena. And Serena was born while my ranch manager, Daniel, was here. In fact, if you look over on the upper right-hand photo of the collage that's there, you will see the dog that I was talking about, Ursu. That's Daniel and his wife, Monica, and the dog Ursu and Serena. I gave Serena to Daniel because Daniel had done such exemplary work for me. He really had made a big impact on Dunrovin, just a wonderful man who helped me in so many ways. He was from Romania, and once his wife got a job in Helena, he and she moved to Helena, and he left Serena here. This was in, I think, 2012, while they found a place to live in Helena, and then they came back and got her. And since then, Serena herself has had a foal. So they now have two horses, and both of them, one of them is Lanza's foal, and the other one is Lanza's grand foal. So Serena was a beautiful horse, just a lovely horse. The next horse is Smokey. And Smokey died this spring as well, as everybody knows. And Smokey was just another gentle giant, just a wonderful horse with people. Not all that friendly with other horses. In fact, sometimes we would have to put a pink ribbon on his tail because he would kick out at other horses, but he was just gentle and kind to his riders, big and small. And he was a big horse and could carry a big man. He was a favorite of several people. The woman in the upper left-hand corner, her name was Danielle, and she rode him for years and just loved him, fell in love with him, and wrote about him. I know many of you have written some of the read some of the things that she did write about him. And then after that, our own Paula, who is still with us, became very attached to him, and I'll show you a picture of Smokey with her in a moment. But you also see Jamie there in the upper right-hand corner. Jamie was very attached to Smokey. Smokey just had this way of inviting people in with his beautiful smoky eye. It was one of the most beautiful horse eyes I've ever seen. It was like a deep amber pool, and it just pulled you in. And he was that kind of horse, a beautiful horse, and a very capable horse, a real sturdy, strong horse that was, very good in the mountains. If you want to switch photos, Jake, I'll show Paula with Smokey. Smokey was painted last year. In fact, he won the contest. He was painted as a seahorse, and that's Paula with him down by the river. And she and we all miss him terribly. He was a real stalwart here at Dunrovin, a wonderful, wonderful horse. And the next horse is Sona. Sona was Lanza's first foal, and a beautiful little foal that a friend of mine, who I used to jokingly tell people that my friend Sally was responsible for Dunrovin having come into existence as a guest ranch. I had given away a horseback ride to the public radio, and Sally was the one who won it. And it was a horseback ride on Denali, whom I just talked about a little bit ago. And she went for the ride, and she wouldn't go home. She just kept hanging around wanting to ride more. And so that kind of started my whole emphasis on guests. And so on a good day, I would give Sally the credit, and on a bad day, I'd give her the blame for Dunrovin coming into existence. But she loved horses, and she bought Sona. I had named him Stormy because he was born on April 15th on a snowstorm right here at Dunrovin. In fact, it was during a Brandon Carpenter clinic. It was a very exciting event because I knew that she was about to give birth. Alonzo was about to give birth, but we stayed out in the barn waiting for her to be born. And indeed, between the 2 days of the clinic, it was a 2-day clinic, she was born, and everybody was all excited the next day. All the horses were excited, the clients were excited, everybody was excited, and it kind of added a whole new dimension to the clinic. But so I called her Stormy, but when Sally bought her, and Sally is pictured here in the lower left-hand corner, and you see Jake and me in the lower right-hand corner. That's a younger version of Jake, and certainly a younger version of me. She renamed her Sona. And then in November of her second year, she was a yearling, Sona was killed right here on our property. And it turned into quite an ordeal trying to figure out how she had been killed. She'd been shot, but we weren't sure whether it was by a gun or by a bow and arrow. And it took some figuring out. My vet is very good at determining these kinds of things, and he figured out that it was shot by an arrow. And it just broke my heart. I have to say that the morning we found her was one of the worst mornings of my life, because she was just a lovely, sweet young horse that had died an unhappy death for sure. She bled to death. And it was just so upsetting. We got the police involved, the sheriff involved. We got Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks involved. It was no longer my horse, so Sally was the one who worked with Montana Fish, Wildlife and Parks, and she was actually paid money by a fund that reimburses livestock owners for animals that are shot by hunters, although I don't think you can call what happened to Sona a hunting accident. It had to have been deliberate. And and I have no idea why anybody would do anything like that. It was horrific. And then the last horse I'm going to talk about is Toddy. And Toddy should be alive right now. I bought Toddy as a young horse, 3.5 in fact, and I never bought horses that young, but Toddy was a very, very special young horse. Just a clown. Look at that photo of him in the lower left hand, and look at him up here in the upper right hand. A beautiful horse. And that's me snuggling with him in the upper left hand. He was just a wonderful horse, a bay horse with a great personality, just a kind, gentle horse. But as he grew, he had what's called wobbles. And it happens in horses with long necks, and he did indeed have a long neck. And what happens is, as the horse grows, the neck actually cuts off the nerves to the other part of the body. It grows in a way that cuts off the nerves. And this happened all so suddenly. He was about 5. We were just starting to really use him, because we rode him very lightly as a 3.5-year-old, and then lightly again as a 4.5-year-old, and then as a 5.5-year-old we really started riding him in the back country, and that's him on the left in the photo on the bottom right. He came back from a mountain ride, and 3 days later I noticed that he was having a hard time with his hindquarters, and that's where the term comes, the term wobbles comes from. Because as the nerve in the neck cuts off the nerve to the rest of the body, it shows up first in the hindquarters. And he was losing his coordination, and I couldn't imagine what was happening. It was dreadful. And so I took him into the vet, assuming that it was some sort of, neurological disease or something, but it was worse than that. It was something that is totally not treatable. And he would have died naturally within a month or 2 of us discovering this, and it would have been an awful death. So I put him down, and it was a great sadness for me. Even though I only had that horse a small period of time, he was a wonderful, wonderful horse, and I miss him still. He would have been just a terrific horse to have had all these years. I had an interesting time putting all these photos together and thinking about all these animals today as I was going to talk with you. It's sad to think of the animals that pass, but I had such joy with them. And when you live your life with animals, you can't have the joy without the sorrow. It's just the part of life, I think, for all of us in any capacity, with our own families, our friends, and certainly with our animals. And I wouldn't walk away from the joy because of the sorrow. I mean, it is a sorrow to me that the chief had to go in and be put down this week. It's a very sad event. But I thank him for all the years of pleasure and all the years of joy he brought to me and to the many people who interacted with him. And I think of the thousands of hours that these horses their names are on this wheel and that have come through Dunrovin have given to all of us the lifelong memories and the beautiful moments of just pure joy of that zest for life, that being in the moment with another animal is such pure pleasure. So I'm going to stay on for a moment to see if anybody has any questions. Speak to me, Jake. Does anybody have any comments or questions? Well, maybe ask them if they have any questions. If not, I'll sign off. Sure. Yeah, let me know if you do have questions, please. Um, he died probably in, it was before Daniel came. So it must have been in like 2007. So he was probably born in 2000. So he would be 18 now, had he lived. Echo? Echo. I didn't include Echo because I never owned Echo. I only Sally owned Echo. And what's interesting about Echo is that I named Echo. Sally was very torn up about Sona dying. And it was just a horrific event. In fact, Sally wasn't even here when it happened. She was in Mexico, and I had to contact her in Mexico when Sona was killed here. And when she came back, we had a service for Sona, and Sally had Sona cremated, and we scattered her ashes here at Dunrovin. And you know, Sally went on for some months before thinking about getting another horse. So she got this lovely Palomino filly, and she was thinking of a name for it. And I was thinking of a name too. It was a beautiful Palomino filly. And suddenly I just suggested to her, because it was a golden horse, I said, why don't you call her Sona's Golden Echo? That way she could think of Sona and her in the same breath. And Sally loved that. And in fact, that name, I liked that name so much that when Augie was born, you know, I wanted to call him Ozzy at some level, but that didn't seem quite right either. And yet I wanted Ozzy in there. And then I remembered Sally and Sona's Golden Echo, and I decided that Ozzy's Golden Echo would fit Augie just perfectly, because he too was golden, and he was echoing somebody that was important to me. I put a lot of stock in names and what names mean, and I really love the fact that Augie reminds me of Ozzy at some level. Any other questions? Nope. Well, I thank you all for joining me. I really enjoyed walking down memory lane with all of my animals. And I'll say good night with that. Good night to you all, and thank you for coming. I'll see you next week. Goodbye.